Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Future of Learning series. It is so great to be here. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, this is a series that unpacks what the future of learning is going to look like. And the reason we're doing that is because we are so passionate about where learning is headed. And the pandemic has just been a force function for the future of how we are going to learn in our work, in our passions, for our kids. And what we decided to do at Gamechanger is bring together some of the world's most prolific thinkers, doers, creators, investors who are all living and breathing the future of learning. And so it is with incredible excitement that I introduce our next guest. As many of you know, before I do that, at Gamechanger, we launched the series right when the pandemic hit to really help people think about the mental models for the future. And in doing so, we realized that education is fundamentally changing. And so we're also incubating our very own live learning platform at Gamechanger called Mastermind. So please get on the wait list at mastermind.co. And I'm so excited to introduce somebody who I believe is living the future of learning. That's David Perell. For those of you who don't know David, David is a writer, a teacher, a podcaster, and he runs one of the best online communities for one of the most important critical skills of the future, which is writing. And when I think about the future, there's a wonderful quote that says, the future is actually here. It's just not evenly distributed. And that basically sums up what David is doing in terms of the future of live learning. So David, welcome to our series. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks. I love that quote. I love that quote. That's really funny that you mentioned that. I think about it almost every day.
It's so good. You know, it's so funny. If I'm being really honest, I don't think I really understood what that quote meant up until recently. And now that I do, I actually think you are the living, breathing version of that quote because not everybody is living in the future. And I fundamentally think you are. So,
Yeah, it's funny. That quote, actually, I think the proper way to put it is living in the present. Marsh McLuhan, who had a huge influence on me, said that we drive into the future looking at our rearview mirror. And what he basically implied by that is that you can only see you can only see the present in the past. And so, like, if you look at your rearview mirror, where you are is actually very different from what you're seeing. And I think that fundamentally the big insight here with that quote is to just try to understand the present and try to think about what in the present moment is going to proliferate out into the world. And it's something that I've always done. I remember the first article I ever wrote that ended up being widely shared was an article called Naked. And it was all about this. It was all about how influencers were starting companies, how people were becoming media
mhm.
companies. And that was a moment where it looked like a prediction of the future when in fact my goal in writing it was to have a very lucid description of what was happening in the present.
I love that. And not only that, I'm equally as big a fan of Marshall McLuhan. In fact, I had the chance many years ago to sit on stage with his son, Eric McLuhan, talking about, he basically has 4 laws of media, and I think they're
Mm-hmm.
very relevant to what you're doing. So let's unpack this. Like the first thing, for those who don't know you, why don't I just give you how I even came across you? I found you on Twitter. Your writing is totally prolific and profound and succinct. And all of a sudden, you're hosting this course that gives me this chance to write like you. And so I apply. Of course, it's completely sold out. And we start chatting. And so, my experience of you is you are living and breathing what you're teaching, which is for me something that I think is absolutely the future of learning. The credibility is I can just see how powerful what I would learn from somebody like you is by the very nature of what you're doing. Why don't we just unpack how you even got to this place? I'd love to hear your story. How did you get to hosting, rite of passage, one of the top virtual live learning schools, and hosting this incredible blog, North Star podcast, and being this writer. Tell me a bit about your journey there.
Yeah, I think one of the big insights was I was 19, living in New York City. I was interning there at the time. I had just graduated from my sophomore year in college. So I was going to my junior year, and I was working for a travel startup at the time. And I was in New York City, 19, and I absolutely hated it. It was awful. And there were a lot of reasons why, but one of them was I felt like I was in looking up at these giant skyscrapers as I was sort of stuck on the ground taking smelly summer subways and just trying to survive in New York. And I knew that I was in a place where there was a lot of stuff happening. I knew that I was in a place where the future was being made, the present was being lived, and I didn't feel like I was a part of that. And so I started reaching out to a lot of people, and I got no responses most of the time. And when I did get responses, it was, hey, why don't you travel across the city to come meet me at the time that's most convenient for me? And because I was interning at the time, that was just fairly hard to do. And I think that the big thing that changed was once I realized that I could start interviewing people. So I had a friend named Corey, and he wasn't a friend at the time. He was the social media manager for Golf Digest magazine. And I'd played college golf. I was a big golfer, and he was 26 years old, which at the time was like, oh my goodness, this guy chock full of wisdom. It's actually the exact age I am now, and which was just hilarious. And I said, Corey, I would love to interview you. So I remember going to 4 Times Square, where the Condé Nast headquarters used to be. I remember going up the elevator, and he scheduled an interview room right above Times Square. We were looking down on it like we were birds soaring over one of the most iconic places in America. And we spoke for about an hour and a half, and I guess I impressed him. 2 weeks later, he gives me a call and says, hey, I have an extra ticket to a conference in San Diego. Would you like to come with me? I said, of course, I would love to. And it sort of kicked off this friendship that, and being really great, but a series of friendships that were with people who I'd met through the internet, who I was then interviewing for the most part, who were then giving me hours of their day. And it just ended up becoming a magnificent way to learn. And I looked at the richness and the texture and the fulfillment of the conversations that I was having over interviews, and contrasted that to the delirious boredom that I felt in my classes in college. And I just said, to hell with school, to hell with traditional education. I mean, I've basically every single institution that I've been a part of, I've lost the game. Every single one, whether it's school, whether it's a job. I got fired from my first job after 7 months and 4 days. And I've seen that whenever I'm in a hierarchy that's very well defined, I lose. And so I knew that I couldn't follow a conventional route. I had horrible grades, horrible test scores, and I really had nothing going for me. And I then began using the internet and figuring out what worked, not because I was smarter than anyone, but probably because I was more desperate for answers.
Oh, such an interesting story and resonates so deeply. I mean, it sounds like this interview as a form of learning, this deep curiosity and this ability to connect with humans, is I found for myself, equally is such a powerful learning tool, right? And I just love what you said. And so obviously we're going to get into the series later around like what's the future of institutions, but I kind of, to your point, want to stay on the present. And you're being pretty humble in terms of your curiosity and your passion and your intellect in doing this. But fast forward to today, you have one of the top virtual live schools around a topic that I think, just like you think, is one of the most important skills for the future. If you're an entrepreneur, if you work in a company, if you're whoever you are, the ability to share and express your ideas and create thought, in a way that people can understand is basically what you do. Tell us more around rite of passage, what it is, how it works, and you have some incredible principles that I just like completely align with in terms of how you run that school. And I'd love you to share a couple of those with our audience.
Yeah, so I'd been writing for a couple years and I'd had a lot of success as an online writer. I think particularly success for how little I've accomplished. Um, I really haven't done much with my life and I'm quite young
You're
and
26, by the way. Let's just
yeah.
remember
Um,
that.
and so I think that I really figured out how to use the internet to make things happen. A lot of the people who have big accounts and who have a lot of credibility. They work for Bloomberg, they've sold a company, they work at a Fortune 500 startup or company that's gone public. They're the CEO of this, CEO of that. I've done none of those things. And so what I realized is that if I'm still having success online, despite that, I have figured out how this game works in ways that are not luck. They're like real skill. And a
Mm-hmm.
skill is an important phrasing. It's not talent. Talent is something that you're born with. A skill is something that can be taught. I was playing
Mm-hmm.
tennis this morning, working on my forehand, and that is at some level a talent, at some level a skill. But I I've been really into the skill side of tennis, and that means that I can actually get better at doing it. And so writing online, there's elements of talent within it, but I've dissected it into a skill. And a lot of people think that writing is just pure art. It's something that can only be
Mm-hmm.
taught. And that's wrong. Human society advances when we take something that we think is an art and we translate it into a skill or into a science. And so, a very specific example of this is, say, Europe in the 14th century, where what you had was you had a very flat style. If you look at medieval painting, it there's not a lot of depth, there's not a lot of um, perspective, and it's very flat, right? You look at those old Christian paintings, and then what happens is from about 1350 to about 1550, you have the explosion of the Renaissance, right, in Florence.
Mm-hmm.
And what kick-started that was mathematical ways of thinking about lines and depth and perspective that then kick-started a explosion in the quality of the artwork. And by 1550, we had these beautiful paintings.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm trying to do with writing. I think that what's happening is online writing right now is in that 1350 stage. There's a lot of people who are sort of following on their intuition and they're very dependent on talent. And I'm trying to basically look at writing and say, what are the timeless principles for online writing that then we can turn into a science?
Yeah.
And my vehicle for distributing those ideas is a writing school called Rite of Passage. And
Mm-hmm.
it has two forms. For me, it incentivizes me and aligns everything where I can live a life that is purely devoted to learning. Like the the synthesis between my incentives and how I want to live are very tightly aligned. And for my students, see, I was doing consulting before, and I was saying the same thing over and over, and I wasn't able to get to this level of depth. And so, what I can do is right over there, about 45 post it notes of 45 ideas that I'm thinking about with writing. And every single day, I sit down and I type one of them up. And so, what I do with
Mm-hmm.
Rite of Passage is I then synthesize all of those ideas, put them into a curriculum of 16 live sessions in 33 days. And what we do is we get two to 400 of the most ambitious writers in the world that we can find. And then we make the price very expensive so that every single person in the course knows for certain that every other person is serious. They're serious about taking the course. And so you might say, well, why would you make it that price. And my question for you is, how many $20 ebooks have you bought and then followed
Oh,
through on? Not many. And what we see is that writing is a lot like fitness, where you've had an explosion of the CrossFits of the world and a lot of the group fitness
mhm.
classes, because when you work out with other people, you go harder. And it's the same thing with writing. When you're with other people, writing changes from a solitary experience of being like Thoreau
Mhm.
going to Walden Pond in 1848 to 1850 or so, and being away from society for 2 years. That's not what writing needs to be. Writing can be communal, it can be dynamic, it can be social, it can be collaborative, and that's what Write a Passage is about.
I love it. And it resonates so deeply on a bunch of levels. So my first question, is, or more comment, and I want to sort of hear your thoughts on it, is the importance of live, right? I mean, you just hit the nail on the head by saying, pre-recorded ebooks, right? Or pre-recorded content or ebooks that are low value but have the ability to scale is not what you're doing. Why is live important, and what's the experience, your community is getting in those live lessons?
In 2000, I was 8 years old. I had one of my first memories ever. It was about 8 o'clock, and Brazil was playing France in, I think it was France, in the World Cup final.
Mm-hmm.
And that year, the World Cup had been played game at about 3 a.m. Pacific time. I'd grown up in San Francisco. So we recorded the game, and I was so excited to watch. So we went out, we went to a bagel shop, and I went with my neighbors, and then we got the bagels, we got the coffee, we went back home, sat on the couch and watched the game. And this was the World Cup final, one of
Yeah.
the biggest events in sports, and we had recorded the game. And it was extremely boring to watch. None of the excitement was there. None of the energy was there.
Totally.
And it was because it wasn't live. And that day, I realized that sports, we don't just watch it because the actual game is good. We watch the game because it's live. And there's
Yeah.
something about being there in the moment that you have to be fully bought in a way that
Mm.
anything recorded doesn't demand from you. It's the same thing when you watch a play. It's the same thing
Totally.
when you watch the fireworks. You
Yeah.
have to be in that moment because the moment basically slips through your hand
Yeah.
like grains of sand in an hourglass. And it's the same thing with writing. Yeah, we offer a lifetime access for a couple
Mm-hmm.
$1,000s more. And the reason that we make it so much more expensive in order to do that
Mm-hmm.
is we want people there. We want people for 36 days to say, I have this moment. And it's like that Eminem line, the moment, like, it's going to slip. And if you don't capture it, it's going to leave. You got one chance. Do not miss this chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime. And that's what he's saying in that song. And that's exactly what we try to do with Rite of Passage. And so when you have that, and then when you have hundreds of people who are committed to that live experience,
Mm-hmm.
you get a group commitment, you get an accountability mechanism, and you get
Mm-hmm.
discipline and drive that you would never get from a pre-recorded course. And see, if you look at where the world is going, a lot of it is going towards lower and lower standards and a lower price of entry. So it's just becoming a no friction world in a lot of ways. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
you're into this Netflix show. If you just want to turn it off, you can turn it off. Oh, you can just sit here in your room and do a talk and then you go to the next thing, right? We've made everything so much easier. And that's often good. But when things are hard, you want high friction. Because high
Totally.
friction, when things are difficulty, that's what creates friendships. And what we want to do is we want to create an experience that is so difficult that it is necessarily transformative.
Mm-hmm.
And I look a lot at the Navy SEALs. Look at the way that Navy SEALs talk about each other. Think of how they talk about that experience. They go through hell week to get through that, but then
Mm-hmm.
for the rest of their lives after, they can look to their left, they can look to their right, and they can say, these are my brothers and sisters. And it is only through difficult experiences that are live, that are cohesive, where those kinds of
Immersion.
relationships are built.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing to add to your thesis, because it's absolutely a mastermind. This is our thesis: is that live learning experiences are really a huge part of the future. Maybe not the only future, but a massive part. And to bring back Marshall McLuhan, it's because of scarcity. In an age of abundance, live experiences can still maintain scarcity and everything else can't, so different way of putting the friction, but I'm totally bought in, and that's why I've applied twice now to get into your course, and when I get in, which hopefully I'll do so for January, I will
February.
100%
Yeah.
February, I will participate. But let's unpack this a bit more. Let's talk more. I know you're super interested in this idea of place. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit as you referenced Florence, for the Renaissance and, different places. Let's talk about the importance of place in the virtual world and, really unpack this peer learning and community learning. Do you see this as a big part of the future of learning? And what do you do to really create place in rite of passage that is very, very different? Like, what are some of the tips and tricks around creating this immersive live learning experience that you're doing?
Yeah, so we often think of genius as something that happens individually. Steve Jobs was a genius. Bill Gates was a genius. Elon Musk is a genius. We don't often think of genius as something that comes out of a place.
Mm.
And Brian Eno, who is a musician and the father of ambient music, has a word called scenius. And what he means by scenius is the genius of a specific place in time. And I think it's really worth thinking about, when are those moments created and what do they have in common? And there's a couple ideas that come to mind for me. The first is, what happened in Edinburgh at the late 1800s, at the beginning of what's now called the Scottish Enlightenment. You had, or the late 1700s, you had Adam Smith, who's the forefather of economics. You had David Hume in philosophy. You had all these different people who were in Edinburgh, a town that's roughly the size of Santa Cruz, California, all who were coming together in that little place and creating these ideas that have now become the foundation of Western thought. Then in about 2008, you had Y Combinator. You had companies like Dropbox, Stripe, Airbnb,
Mhm.
Reddit. They all came out of this little startup accelerator studio that was in the South Bay. And what did those two experiences have in common, those two places? And I have ideas, I don't have answers. I think with culture, the lines are fuzzy, right? It's not like mathematics where 2 plus 2 always equals 4. With
Mhm.
culture, there's ingredients, it's very context dependent, but that's also what makes it interesting to me, that the qualitative aspects.
Mhm.
And there's two things that come to mind. The first is anti-scale, and the second is where weird is cool. And so
Mhm.
I'll take each of them. So, there's a lot of people who come out and they say, why doesn't Harvard become bigger? Why doesn't Princeton become bigger? If these schools are so great, why don't they triple, quadruple their size? And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. But one of the things is that scale changes the nature of interactions. If you could summarize complexity theory in one pithy sentence, it's not that more is bigger, is that more is different. Different emergent properties emerge in a
Mhm.
culture, and the culture begins to change in ways where the sum is different than its parts, not just
Mhm.
greater than its parts.
Mhm.
And that's what we try to do with rite of passage, where rather than expanding the size of the cohort to get thousands and thousands of students, well, I could probably make more money doing that and all these sorts of things. But it ruins that sameness, that size where
Mhm.
you can be in breakout rooms, you can look at the other people in the course, and you can say, I know that person. I know that person. I know that person. And I always sort of have this joke that there will be a moment in time where two rite of passage students get married. And the very fact that that's sort of what I'm thinking about, like I want relationships between not just like it's obviously not a dating service, but like the fact that two people could get so close in 36 days that then can
Mhm.
inspire these friendships, that's what I'm going for, because writing isn't something that you do for 5 weeks. It's something that you do for a lifetime. And then, really quickly, the second one is weird is cool. And I think Y Combinator did a real job of this, of encouraging you to be idiosyncratic in how you thought about entrepreneurship and the world, and to get to a place where what was sort of the normal thing to do was very different from baseline reality. And if you can have that with anti scale, you can have really good friendships with the kinds of people who you'd never meet otherwise.
I love that. I mean, what you're really saying is that it's not just about a sage on stage, teaching you something. It's also about the relationships, the peer learning, the community, the sort of lifelong friendships that form. And even for Gamechanger, we just started this a few months ago. It is one of my favorite parts about this community of watching the relationships begin to emerge. And so I'm just actually going to encourage Gamechanger folks. And please put your questions in our chat because David, we'll switch to questions in about 20 minutes. But I also want to go a little bit deeper, right? So if you look at the future, and I know you've said, the future of learning looks like Y Combinator, right? The future of learning looks like rite of passage. One of the other questions I have is around accreditation, right? And the
Hmm.
importance of that and how that changes. And something that I will share is that for me, and this is the offer to all of your audience, David, and I hope you go and tell them this, I will hire a rite of passage, not only one, I will hire at least 3 rite of passage grads because I am convinced that they know how to write online. And so I'll sort of start with there, and maybe we can talk about what do you see as the future of accreditation, and we can kind of get into the role of institutions in that as sort of these new learning paradigms emerge.
Yeah, so there's two kinds of accreditation. There's the hard part of accreditation is sort of what kind of accreditation, because I actually think that colleges do a decent job of accreditation, and I'm not nearly as sort of bearish on the colleges as I think a lot of people are, although we
Mm-hmm.
need different systems. The problem with education actually isn't the way that we teach. The problem with education is that we have one system for everybody. And so what we need is a flowering of different systems, one of which is the very standard way. And that is why I'm trying to build rite of passage and making different sort of investments in homeschooling, another two
Mm-hmm.
stealth education companies now, just trying to really sort of fracture the way that we teach. So there's just a lot more optionality of I want to go this route, I want to go that route, depending on my personality type. But the thing with accreditation is things need to be sufficiently hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry that the actual education system actually just isn't hard enough right now. And a very subjective data point is that it used to be that you could go to a Harvard or a Columbia and you could study whatever you wanted, and what you majored in didn't really matter. So you could go to Harvard or Columbia and major in the classics, you could go major in philosophy, and that was basically as good as majoring in engineering or something else. But two things happened. The first is that, I mean, really just the standard and the quality of education went down. And I look back at my college experience, it was not hard and it was not rigorous. And every now and then I'll talk to people who went through a rigorous liberal arts program 20 years ago, and they really had to work. And what's happened is we've sort of postponed the time in education where things get hard to graduate degrees, masters, and then really PhDs. Those are the things now that have basically had this credential inflation where a PhD now might be what an undergrad was in, say, 1960. And so what's happening with accreditation is you need some combination of a brand that is common knowledge, meaning that everybody knows that brand. Then you need something that is sufficiently difficult and selective. And difficulty and selective are sort of two sides of the same coin. Difficulty is sort of what comes out, selective is
Mm,
what comes in. And if you have something that is sufficiently difficult and selective, and then everybody knows that, like everyone knows Harvard in a way that not everybody knows Alt MBA, then you begin
right.
to create accreditation. But because everyone needs to know something, it is quite hard to build accreditation. And I think that that's going to take a long time to do.
Mm. Super interesting. I'm so glad you brought up Alt MBA because Seth Godin is our next guest next week, who is also,
Nice.
somebody who really pioneering the future of learning experiences. So, for all of those listening, thank you for sharing that. And I agree. I think what you're saying is brands matter, signaling matters, right? Institutions were really, really good at signaling, right? If you went to Harvard, it was a way to differentiate you from thousands of other people. But whether it's worthy or not is really questionable. So that's kind of what I'm hearing you say there. So let's just open it up even more broadly. When you think about, I know you're a big Peter Thiel fan, I think, and somebody who,
Absolutely. Someone called me a Peter Thiel scholar last week. My roommate did, and it was the proudest
yeah,
moment of my life.
there you go. Actually, one of the companies I invested in, a company called Helper, he's actually a Peter Thiel scholar, which is very exciting for. He's reinventing a heart monitor with very, very precise signals. So it's very interesting.
Hmm.
No,
Nice.
let's. One of the things that he talks about is sort of how to think about the best opportunities online. And so, as somebody who's living the future of live learning, what do you see from your vantage point playing right at the center of live learning experiences to be the big opportunities that still haven't been solved that people should be solving? Right. So what's, I think you mentioned what's valuable, what's unique to your perspective, and what is nobody doing yet that you think the future absolutely needs as it relates to learning experiences?
Man, if I have a good answer for this question is worth about $1 billion. So let me just say one more point about accreditation, which is actually me just postponing that extremely difficult question. And so I'm just being honest about what's happening now. So one more thing with accreditation is this is one of the reasons that why writing is really a great way to sort of get that left lane of accreditation. What writing allows you to do is writing is proof of work for thinking. And so writing gets you to a place where if you have written a book about something, whether the book is good or not, at the very least, you know that with your friend Samantha, and she says, "Oh, I wrote a book about that." You basically know that she's thought more about a subject, and writing does that in a way that not video, not podcasting, not any other medium does. Is it basically is a signal to the world that you've thought about something. And what's interesting about writing online is with the accreditation, the way it's redone is we look at follower counts as an engagement. Engagement is much more interesting than follower counts as a proxy and a signal for what people are resonating with and how much people are basically certifying that this person is credible. So that's actually why I like writing online. I was talking earlier about my lack of credentials. My Twitter account is now worth more than my Harvard degree, and I can get to people and make opportunities happen and very clearly get into investments that even big name venture capitalists can't get into because of the signals and the accreditation that I have from my online presence. So that's what I love about writing online. You no longer need to pay
Mhm.
hundreds of thousands of dollars to get these signals through traditional education. You can now do it by working, but you need to be self motivated. Now,
Mm.
I got to answer your question. So I think that there are a lot of different sort of ways to cut what's going on, but the question is, how will video unbundle? And I'm seeing it always. Like everyone's sort of trying to build these platforms that are basically these fracturing of Zoom, and it's a real accident of history, as popular as it is in this moment of in time, and it's because of COVID, where usually what happens is the rate of technological change goes slightly faster than
Mm.
people's adoption of technology. And what happened with COVID was sort of like this, where technological change was going slightly faster, and then the world switched, and our adoption went way ahead of where the technology was ready. And Zoom was one of the big beneficiaries of that. So what we have right now is we have a world that is pulling with its demand of different video platforms, and now the market is beginning to respond. And Zoom is made for a lot of different purposes. It is very clearly not made for education. It doesn't really embed curriculum. It doesn't really embed good one on one messages. The chat is
Mhm.
kind of ephemeral. What if the chat could be consistent from session to session? What if the chat then had a place where you could manage different assignments and different writing? Maybe you could do live feedback. And so it's very clear that Zoom works for education, but it's not built for education. And what's very interesting to me is not how do we recreate the classroom, but how can we do things with the internet that we would never be able to do in a classroom setting. And one of the great examples is breakout rooms. Breakout rooms are the best invention to live education in years because what they allow you to do is go from scale to one on one with the click of a button. Whereas when I was in school and we were doing that, we'd have to rearrange the chairs. It was really disruptive. And we no longer have to do that. And that is the line of thinking that entrepreneurs should be going down.
I love it. If you see the huge smile on my face, it's because we're so aligned, right? We are at Mastermind. I mean, this was the genesis for us really rethinking so much of what you're talking about, so that you absolutely can make learning experiences purpose built, right? Like Zoom, it's
Mm-hmm.
great that we're using Zoom right now. It's awesome. It can be used for lots of things. But, it's the 0.0001, in my opinion, of where we're going to go around learning experiences in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that. And we'll definitely keep in touch around how we're thinking about it because it's super aligned. So I'm super aware of time. We don't have that much time before we have some amazing questions. But one of the questions I have for you is really around this idea of owned platforms and open platforms. And you're kind of like a master of both, right? You're talking a lot about signaling and sort of the social accreditation on open platforms like Twitter. But then, I see everywhere on your writing for people not to join your Twitter following, but to sign up for your email newsletter and to listen to your direct communications. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship going forward and the importance of that for creators and teachers and experts?
Yeah, so when Amazon was negotiating with hotels for having Alexa in a lot of hotel rooms, one of the reasons that they did it was marketing, where if you use an Alexa in a hotel room, it's not that Amazon is making a lot of money off of that. It's that Amazon is expanding the number of people who use the Alexa platform and say, this is pretty cool. I should get one for my house. And what's going on is Amazon is having a marketing expense and then they're getting the money and then they're getting people into the Alexa at home. And writing online is the same way, where there are what you could call open platforms. And
Mm-hmm.
these are things like Twitter, these are things like Reddit, Hacker News. These are platforms that anybody can use. And
Mm-hmm.
what's great about them is that these are places where anybody can find you. So you can go viral on Twitter, you can go viral on Reddit. And that's great because it increases your exposure. But the problem with exposure is it's ephemeral. It's a moment in
Mm-hmm.
time, and those people disappear. They're not with you. They found you on Reddit. They didn't remember your name. We an article on Medium or on Substack, and a friend will say, "We're on Medium and on Substack." You don't say the writer's name a lot of the time. But those platforms help you with distribution. So what you want to do is you want to convert audiences from those open platforms into your owned ones, like email, like a text message service.
Mm-hmm.
And then what
Mm-hmm.
happens is you have a direct relationship with those. So now, if something were to happen, like my email service provider could go down tomorrow, and I would still have those emails. They're saved on my computer. And those emails, more than 40,000 emails of people who have relationships with me, is one of my most valuable assets. It is more valuable than anything else I own, that email list. But my Twitter account, if I owned that data, would probably be even more valuable. But the problem is, if Twitter shut down tomorrow, I would have to
Mm-hmm.
start from scratch.
Right.
So what
Or
I
if they
do,
Oh, I was just going to say, or if they don't allow you to reach them on an ongoing basis, right? So maybe only 5% of that list actually sees anything you post, right? Just
exactly.
adding fuel on the fire of sort of your brilliant strategy, which we fundamentally believe at Mastermind is 100% creator owned access to your community, right? Ultimately, you want to have those relationships. And that, I think you said it beautifully, which is that's your asset, right? That's ultimately the
Mm-hmm.
business you're building. So I love that.
Right.
Uh,
Right. And so the goal
yeah.
is to get from the opened into the owned and get people from Twitter into email. Otherwise, you don't own your audience. And if you don't own your audience, you can't dependably continue to
Mhm.
build relationships with them over time. They sort of find you and they begin to wither away very quick.
Yeah, super interesting. So, David, this I could go on talking to you literally for hours because we've only covered even a small percentage of what I would have liked. But this is the start, hopefully, of some conversations about something we both love, which is the future of learning. I'm just going to do, before I jump to questions from our community, and we have a bunch of really great ones, two things. One, as I said, Seth Godin is next Monday. So for all of our listeners, please join us. It's a continuation of some really interesting perspectives. And we have some amazing partners, David, who are sharing this incredible conversation with our community of learners who are all passionate. And everybody on this interview stream, I hope you all take David's course and join me. If you can even get in, is what I will say, because I know there's a super big wait list in February. But a big thanks to our partners, Toronto Life Insider, York University. You'll love this, David. Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. They are very, very
Nice.
passionate about the future of learning, so we can touch on that because I know David is a big fan. General Assembly, the Knowledge Society, Getting Smart, Tech Toronto, Rotman, the Canadian Innovation Exchange, and W North. Thank you so much. And David, I'm going to now read you a couple of the amazing questions from our Gamechanger and Mastermind community. The first one being from Jacqueline. So hi, Jacqueline. Welcome. Jacqueline asks, please comment on the relationship between scarcity, elitism, exclusion, or exclusivity. How do you think about that?
Say it one more time.
She said, I think especially in reference maybe to the fact that you charge high price points for your courses, can you talk about the relationship between scarcity, elitism, exclusion, or exclusivity, or even the fact maybe that college today is so expensive? How do you think about democratizing access to education.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, for me, the high price point sort of allows me to share all of these ideas online. I think that the vast majority of what I do is free, and I think that yeah, college is way too expensive. It's a real problem. Um, there's a lot in that question. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. But look, things that cost money you take seriously, and um, the challenge is, and this is one of the big differences between college and online learning. So in college it's really expensive, but most people don't feel the burden of that cost in the moment, which
Mm,
then has them not working as hard. And let me break down exactly what I mean by that. So
mhm,
there's a number of people who come from wealthy families and their parents pay for college. That is a fraction of society. And then there's a bunch of other people who get locked into student debt. But if you actually talk to at least the ones I know who have been in student debt, when they're 19 years old, they're not feeling the weight of the paper that they signed. So they pay the costs of that, which are remarkably brutal when they're in their 20s, but when they're in college, they don't feel the weight of that. And so what happens is they don't take learning quite as seriously. I say this because I had a couple friends in college who were way older. They'd already made money, and then they were paying with their own money for college, and those people just work harder. It is just true. And that is actually the model that online learning is creating. What online
mm,
learning is doing is it is getting you to a place where you pay a lot up front and it's your own money and you're not on loans. And so because of that, you've handed over the money and then you start immediately, which creates a whole culture of people who are hyper committed in a way that I've never seen with the traditional university system.
yeah.
But the counterfactual that I just saw was I had a friend who started a company in high school, sold it when he was about 20 years old, and then went back to college to study philosophy. And I've never seen someone take college so seriously. And it was just a
Mm,
joy to watch how he grappled with the great philosophers of the last
mm.
300 years and gave it his all. And I think that there's a strong correlation between people who have to pay their own way through college and they do it by paying upfront, and how serious those people are when they actually get to school.
Super interesting. The next question we have here is from Andrew, and he has a really interesting question as it relates to learning, in my opinion, which is, can you talk a little bit more about how we have better conversations? And I think that's super interesting, especially in social contexts or social media contexts, which seem to proliferate in society today.
Yeah, so I'm just going to do in person conversations.
Sure, or in person, even better.
Yeah, so conversations are like a fire where it's really hard to get a fire going, but once you do, it is relatively easy to make that fire bigger. And so when you have conversations, what you're trying to do is find the spark. And in
Mm,
order to find that spark, you want to get to a place where you just find that thing where both of you are like, yeah, 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 I'm excited about that. And one of the things that you want to do if you sort of insist on having a really good conversation is focus on what energizes the other person. You do searching for that spark. And this is one of the reasons to be polymath is you don't need to know a lot about a lot of different things to spark conversation. You just need to know enough that then you can create that fire. So say that you're talking to somebody who is an expert in New York City history. Well, one time I did a tour of the New York subway where I went underground. We went to an old abandoned terminal under City Hall. We looked at the way that the track switching happened. We went to the middle of the platform where there are these cameras for the second conductor in the middle of the train. I learned all about these things. And if I can just have that much knowledge, then I can talk to this expert about New York City and begin to gain that conversational momentum. And then from them, what is it that excites them? And if you can
Mhm.
follow that North Star of excitement, the conversation then becomes much more interesting and energetic.
I love that so much, especially how you reference this idea of polymaths and, another word, or just expert generalists, which I think is sort of what we've lost in some ways in our industrialized, specialized education system. And I know something you're super passionate about, which is sort of the liberal arts, right? And in some ways, just tying the connective tissue, the connective dots there, it's this idea of being able to ask really good questions versus having to know this very specialized knowledge that can lead to really powerful conversations. So that's super helpful, I think, to our audience on just how to sort of learn to ask great questions and sort of be in conversation around passion. So I'm going to ask, there's one, I have a ton more questions here, but I'll just ask one more from our audience. I think a really interesting one that Ron asked is talking about kids and the way kids learn. And I'm actually interested in two parts of that, which Ron says teachers traditionally teach kids. Should kids be more involved teaching other kids? Are we missing live learning opportunities in schools today? Would love to hear what you have to say about that one.
Yeah, we got to get rid of age segregation. It is absurd that you spend as much time as you do with people who are 1 year older than you to 1 year younger. It is an accident of history. It stunts the
Mm-hmm.
growth, and we shouldn't do it. It's simple as that. There are reasons to do it. You should probably spend more time with people your age than other age groups, but we basically lock our kids in the prisons that are school for all day, and they can either hang out with a bunch of babysitter people who are called teachers, or they will be with other people their age. It's ridiculous, it's absurd, and we need to stop doing it. And what we should do instead is spend a lot more time with people who are older than us in a much more unstructured environment. And those people could be kids who are a little older, and yeah, there'll be some things that are difficult. You'll get bullied. I was bullied really bad. You'll will teach you things, and you'll have to grow up faster. I spend a ton of time with people who are older than me. I think that at least in New York, I would spend about half of my time with 20s. I'm with people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. One of my best friends in New York was a 55-year-old mom. I was friends with their two daughters who were in high school. Her husband was awesome. We went apple picking upstate New York. I was in learning religion, so I good at them. I'm not Christian. And we hosted a discussion group every week about Christianity. And I think in 2019, so last year, I saw her more individual times than any other friend I had. And I think that's fairly rare in the modern world of having good friends who are way older than you. But I think that it
Mm-hmm.
goes the other way too, that when you spend time with people who are younger, you become a mentor. You become somebody who can teach others. And you also get to a place where you're just more open minded about the possibilities in life. And I think that that's really good too. My general point here is we shouldn't get rid of age segregation, but we're just way too over indexed on that strategy, and it's time to change that. We're stunting the growth of humans, and it's one of those things that if somebody who lived in the 1700s, if they came here to observe our society, of course they'd be like, whoa, internet, whoa, phones. And that would sort of be the shock value. But then there would be things that are sort of these deeper undercurrents of how the world works. And one of the things that would surprise them is the amount of age segregation in our society.
Super interesting. David, we could keep going. There's so many more questions, but what I'm going to do, since you're always on Twitter, I'm just going to tweet the rest of the questions at you later
Cool.
today. And I just want to say a huge thank you. I have so enjoyed this conversation, as has our community. I just love meeting people who are as passionate about the future of learning and certainly live learning as I am. And so I love what you're doing. I can't wait to do Rite of Passage. I can't wait to hire people from Rite of Passage. So share with your audience and community. I think you are doing something exceptional. And to bring it full circle back to what I said before, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And thank you for showing us what the future looks like. With
Thank you very
gratitude,
much.
thank you for joining us today. Take care.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Looking forward to it.